Hello, art students. Welcome to today's lecture with me, Professor William Wright, over Chapter 9 of Living with Art by Mark Getline. We're actually going over Chapter 9 and a little more, some things that I add in just for fun, but we will start this video. It's actually the second half of this slide, which covers Chapter 8 and 9. And a little bit more. Yeah, let's go ahead and starting on chapter 9, talking about photography. So yeah, we're going to talk about the development of photography, which happened throughout the 19th century, and how, throughout our art history sections, we'll talk about what it meant. But yeah, let's just at first talk about the technology and its development. So I like to show these funny pictures of the original selfie and oldest picture of a lady sneezing. Good laugh. Anyway, the original camera was developed as a artistic tool, a light phenomenon based tool called a camera obscura. It's essentially a light tight space. It can be a small box or a full-size room where there is a small hole. The entire space is blocked of light except for one small hole through which to go through and project through which projects an image of what is outside of the room. Basically, yeah, that sentence isn't very well written, but yeah, basically, inside of the box or the room, it's totally dark. The small light that is allowed to shine through, the small bit of light, essentially will project whatever is on the outside of that room upside down and a little bit fuzzier if the opposite wall is positioned just right. Okay, so basically you can see it. It's better to see the demonstrations here. You can see here inside of this light tight space, they've blocked it from all light. There's a small hole and there's an image of a man standing outside of it. Well, if you were to be able to get inside of that small room, you would see, if you could get the distance of this wall just right, you would see a reflected image of the man outside on the opposite wall. Again, providing you're not blocking the light and providing the wall is at the right distance and all this. And essentially, they started to understand this phenomenon, and they used lenses and they used technology to develop what we came to know as the modern camera obscura, the modern camera, or what we call now like a peephole camera. There's a specific word for it, I can't remember, but essentially just small camera obscuras. They're often like a first project in an advanced photography class. You develop your own light tight space. You put a small hole in one wall, and then you can set something you move it and you set it at the right distance so that you actually see a reflection of what is on the other side of that hole. It's a pretty cool phenomenon. It's actually still just like blows my mind that it just, I guess it like cinches up the light waves enough and then spreads them as they move into the room so that then they can be caught and used as a copy of what's on the other side. Okay, so how they took the idea of the camera obscura and turned it into the modern camera is a whole story in and of itself. It's good to know that masters use this. We know that people knew how that camera obscura worked for many, many years. They figured out they could make a sheer wall or like almost like put a canvas or paper that they wanted to draw at the place where the reflection was going to be best, and they could trace it. They could use it as some sort of aid. Vermeer is famously, people always have wondered if he used some sort of camera obscura because there's little nuances of the way that the girl with the pearl earring is lit and positioned that make you think like, man, he couldn't have done this without photography. There's obvious usage again of the camera obscura phenomenon in art that was made prior to the invention of the camera as we know it. But what really changed it as we got through the Industrial Revolution and started to understand the sciences better, we developed light sensitive surfaces. Okay, so we could take our camera obscura and we could put a piece of light sensitive paper or other material inside of it and then just open up the little peephole or spy hole for a brief time, and it would let the light in. The light sensitive paper would catch the light. It would record the waves of light coming through, And then if treated carefully, it could be treated to show you the image that was on the other side. So it would literally permanently keep a copy of that image that was outside. Okay, so that is how we started to develop the camera. And then we start to see cameras like daguerreotype and tintypes and things that we start to recognize, the classic, the guy with the box on the legs, that he's under the little shadow and he opens it up for a second. There's light coming in and then he closes it and then he can develop it all. It has to be done in the dark, the development, the stopping of the light sensitivity and all that sort of stuff. But it's pretty indicative of those images we see of early photographs. It's this initial development of light sensitive things. So basically daguerreotypes were literally taking a sheet of copper that was treated with iodide or silver. Then you would basically set it, that iodide and silver made it light sensitive. You set it in the box. You would open up the box, which is, like I said, a camera obscura, and it has lenses to make it more clear. And that light would come through and be recorded onto the copper plate. Then all in darkness, you would close it off again. And all in darkness, you would fume it with mercury. So that was probably really good for those guys under those dark hoods. They would fume it with mercury, and then they would treat it chemically to stop it being light sensitive, right? So it would stop recording new information. And you end up with these basically little pieces of silver with perfectly recorded images. It's actually still amazing to me that technology this early on had this level of detail on it. And you can see it was the earliest publicly available photographing method starting in 1939. Here's a picture of Daguerre himself, the guy who created this whole process or used the previous processes to really nail it down in the daguerreotype. You will see a high level of detail. Now, what's interesting, if you ever see a daguerreotype or tintype, it's like a holographic almost, right? If you hold it at the wrong angle, you won't be able to see it. It's all about how the metal has changed shape in chemistry to reflect light back at you. And here's an image of the first one, including people. Now, there weren't a lot of images of people for several decades that were in action, right? It took a long time to be able to do things quickly. The initial phases of understanding how to treat the plates, it took several minutes of exposure sometimes, or at least several seconds. So you don't get a lot of action shots early. It's actually kind of an unknown thing that a lot of times some of the early photographs you see of people were actually when they were already deceased, because that was like the best way to get them to sit still, especially photos of children. They're often deceased, but that may be a rumor, but at the end of the day, it's just it kind of shows that it took some time for the metal to be exposed. But as we continue to develop, we have more and more photography. We have this daguerreotype of Zachary Taylor, the first president to have his photograph taken. Pretty impressive work there. Very cool image that we get to see that. But again, all of these, not only did they take a long time, so they were limited in their usage, but the other thing, besides having to expose for a long time, was that there was only one copy of this. There was just only ever that silver plate that floated around, could be easily scratched, easily damaged, couldn't be developed into more photos. So they just started to develop some more technology, and basically what happened is the creation of the collodion type, which was essentially the same process, but on glass, right? Or something that was transparent. They figured out that if they treated it right, they would adjust the chemicals and they would expose glass rather than metal, that essentially it would record the image into the glass and it could be see-through or have light shine through it, right? And that's when they figured out, well, we'll treat it so that it does a negative image, right? So you expose the glass plate. By this time, they're having much quicker exposures. You expose the glass plate, you treat it, you finish it, and rather than a finished photograph, you have a negative copy of that light that came through, right? So the darks are light and the lights are dark, okay? But then they would go in, they've coated it, they sensitized it, they've treated it so that now they have this negative glass image, And then they figured out from having the negative image that they could recreate the daguerreotype process basically on paper. They call it albumin print. They would use egg white, salt, silver. They would treat the paper to be light sensitive, and then rather than exposing it to the individual scene that they wanted to capture, they would just expose it to that glass plate, right? So they would make the paper light sensitive. They would expose it briefly under that glass negative, and then it would basically be the proper positive copy of that image that they had originally captured as a negative on the glass, right? They would bathe it in sodium thiosulfate to fix the paper and make sure it didn't keep developing. And yeah, you basically end up with a reproducible version of your photograph, right? So this is the initial printing or printmaking of photographs. They figure out how to do glass, then they could expose that glass onto paper. Pretty impressive, because now you can have an infinite number. As long as that glass, negative glass, you have a reproducible image. So we see here, I think this is a modern use of the albumin print, like just from like the 90s or 2000s. And then this is, but still we compare it to the older versions of albumin print, and it's still pretty impressive in its level of detail, right, and ability to reproduce. Okay, then this leads to figuring out, we could do, the invention of plastic, more industrial revolution. We have photo negatives that can be plastic. You can have several. They can be small. It can be compact. It can expose really quickly, right? And so you have like Kodak film is developed, right, as like many little squares of negatives that then you can print and produce copies off of. And then of course they also figure out how to basically get a tintype. That Polaroids are basically tintypes that happen like instantly. This is like a camera obscura with a little light sensitive sheet of paper that gets exposed, then gets treated, and does everything all just in a few seconds. So this, Polaroids are not far from the original technology in some ways. But yeah, we have film cameras, we have Polaroids, and we just start to see more and more use of photographs. We've already talked a little bit about how photography becoming popular means that artists' job changes, right? Because if you're a photo artist, now your job becomes the recording of the world. If you were a painter, you no longer have to record the world, and so you have to communicate your perception of the world, right? So it has a profound effect on art. But the big thing in talking about photography is, of course, the recording of what's going on in a much more immediate and specific, accurate way. So we see, of course, the very first war that was ever photographed was the Civil War, and the broader public starts to understand how awful war can be. We then have World War II, then World War I, then World War II, and more people get to see what it's actually like. And you could say over that next 100 years of photographing really what war is like, you can really see that soon we change our perception almost completely of war, because everyday people can look at exactly what it's like, and war drastically changes over that next 100 years, and then in the 100 years since World War I, and so on. But in any case, yeah, we document the world. We have this documentation, this great documentation by Dorothea Lange of the Great Depression, right? That basically, like, journalism is born, right? Recording and keeping a track of what's going on in the world. But we also, it's not to say that there aren't people that aren't using photography for creation of art in and of itself, using the technology to create perceptions, moods, or copies of images that are more artistic and become their body of work. So we have photojournalists as well as photo artists. Yeah, we just see some really amazing stuff come out of the creation of this, including one that you might not have thought about up until this point. And now I'm going to talk about looking at this image, right? This is going to tie back to what I'm teaching about. Looking at this image, we see this old version of horses and some dogs running. And we see that this is clearly predating the creation of the camera and technology that could record a horse running. So something it's kind of funny to look at through art history is that there was this long debate about how to draw horses running, because without any technology to make them stop in the middle of running, or have a way to look at it, we didn't really know, right? So we saw horses as sort of supermaning through the air, right? Because it was just their legs were just a blur, and this must be how they run. They're almost like magic carpet riding, like through the air. And most depictions of horses were done in this way, and other animals that are running that are too fast for us to understand. And essentially, as we develop camera technology, a couple guys who have been on the camp of like, there's just no way this is right, this is inaccurate, we have to figure out what it really looks like. They start to realize we can figure out what horses really look like running using camera technology. And there was this guy, Leland Stanford, who was an equestrian, a well-known horse trainer who had just always had a problem with these depictions of horses running, right? And he went to an artist and a guy who had some knowledge of photo technology, whose name was Muybridge. And Muybridge essentially, at first he was like, no, like camera technology will never be fast enough to get a horse. It's still too crazy. We'll never get it done. And I think I remember hearing stories that there were people who were basically betting against Leland, that the whole bet was whether or not all four legs came off of the ground. And I think Leland did not believe they came off the ground. Everybody else said they did. But either way, the depictions were coming into question. So in any case, they, over the course of a decade or two, Muybridge and Stanford, Edward Muybridge was his name. They start to figure out how to use camera technology in a way that can capture a horse running. And essentially, what they create is this series. They set up a whole bunch of cameras that are on tripwires, and they figured out how to get them to expose instantly, right? So it's just like 1 second of exposure and it's done. Not even 1 second, but less than that. And it will capture each place where the horse is at will be captured by the camera that's tripping it. And they do some trials. Sometimes they're too blurry, sometimes they don't work. But essentially, in the end, they end up with this series of photographs of a horse running. In 1878, this is Muybridge's horse. Many of you have probably seen it. And you can see actually that Leland Stanford, I guess, if he really didn't believe that all four legs came off the ground, he was proven wrong, because it does happen. However, at no point is the horse just full on all four legs up supermaning out. So in a way, he's proven right, because that's an improper depiction of painting animals, and specifically horses in this case, right? But they figure this out, and they've done all these trials. It's an amazing, industrious form, like new invention when it comes to art and the depiction of things. But in addition to all this, something that happens is they figure out, if they set up a little viewing of each one of these photos and then they run them through really fast, they can make it look like the horse is running right in front of their face, right? And this is a mind-blowing invention that leads to, if you haven't figured it out, the motion picture industry, right? Essentially, they figure out that they can expose, throughout time now, we've gotten more and more frames, more photographs per second. But even just doing like 12 to 24 photographs per second, if you photograph a person doing something and take this many photos and then run them past your eyes real fast, you can rewatch the person doing that thing. And that creates films, movies, pictures, right? And that we could do. There's whole classes about motion pictures, but I just want to talk about the creation of film. The first movies, La Voyage, La Lune. The first movie, most likely, I think it's like 17 minutes long. Again, if you can go to the slides and check out this link, it is well worth watching. It's kind of funny. It's cool to look at the props. There's no dialogue. Obviously, they haven't figured out how to get audio onto this, and I don't even know how they do that eventually. But essentially, it's pre-talkies. It's a silent film. But you can see these really innovative ways of manipulating camera angles and things like that are pretty cool. And it's only a few minutes, and it's pretty weird. Maybe some nightmare stuff in there, but it's worth a watch. And then, of course, there's modern artists. Guido van der Verve is a modern performance artist who mostly just records videos. He doesn't perform in front of audiences as much as for the cameras. He does these specific art pieces, and then you watch the film, and it's really like high art, performance art stuff. Yeah, and again, well worth the watch. One of my favorites. And yeah, I mean, we obviously know pretty much all of us have been on video now, and we know how to perform. And there are people who make their living on just living their life in front of a camera now, and it's pretty amazing. But yeah, film as a fine art medium is born. So pretty cool. Now, that kind of gets us through everything I want to talk about with photography and film, but let's briefly talk about some other things that sort of change around. Everything changes once we have the camera, and artists get to start thinking about their role outside of recording the world. And one of the things that happens, and this is kind of covering, it's a whole new media, but I want to talk about alternative media and found object. And basically what I'm talking about here is conceptual art where the idea is the medium, right? And I should probably put that explicitly into the title here, but the idea is the medium. And I like to talk about this. One of my favorite conceptual artists is Joseph Kosuth, who had this piece here and pieces like it, where this is 1 and 3 chairs, right? And it's about the fact that there's one chair in the room. That's it. But at the same time, there are 2 other chairs. One is a photograph of a chair, and the other is the definition of a chair, right? So it's 1 chair, but it's also 3 chairs. And in this case, it's no chairs because it's a slide about it. But just joking. No, but it's the idea that the idea of a chair is the medium, right? And then the objects are just a recording of that shows you that he's talking about the idea. And then you get into like, well, what if you're talking about French, where it's chaise, or I believe it's silla in Spanish, right? Like chair, right? Ooh, I hope that's right. But yeah, there are other languages where the chair is other words, right? So it's not 1 and 3 chairs; it's 1 chair to us, but then uh, the definition is just gibberish, right? It's just letters to them. I don't know. It's a very interesting idea. And then of course, yeah, you get into Marcel Duchamp, who did the twisted, or the turned urinal, and called it the fountain, right? And put a different guy's name on it. And it's all about like the concept of like, just all he did was change a urinal. So all he did was have the idea of looking at a urinal differently, right? That's the medium, right? It's odd. And then looking at this, so this is actually one that I really enjoy. Putting the bicycle wheel on a stool basically renders them both useless. You can't sit on the stool, you can't ride the bicycle. It's a pretty bizarre change, but it's changing our perception. It's changing our way of thinking of these things. Now, is it about formal elements? Is it about the line, the shape, the sculptural elements? Is it about that you can't use either of them, or is it about some new way of using them? Right? The idea is what changes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about different ways of doing this. We have already looked at this, in assemblage and found object. Found object becomes more and more popular because the idea behind the object, again, is in itself more important than the object. So the mixture of objects, the changing of our perception of objects in terms of how they relate to each other, or how they're colored, or how they're positioned, right? It changes, and the idea of looking at these objects changes. But let's talk about some different ways of doing this here. I like to just say the world is your oyster, or an oyster can literally be your oyster, right? And you can look at materials. Right here is the material, the fact that it's just like random scraps and trash. Is that the medium, or is the light the medium, or the shadow, right? That this is just junk situated to make it look like portraits on the back wall, right? This is a drawing, is it sculpture, or is it the idea, right? Or is it's I don't know. And really here, we're just talking about using materials in different and unique and postmodern ways. And real quickly, just a few last slides here, I want to talk about the different ways that this is done. So of course we have traditional uses of non-traditional materials. So this is sculpting out of things that are objects, like found objects that have other uses, but doing it in a traditional way. So like these images of David Mock just taking clothes hangers and sculpting really specific traditional sculptures out of them. I guess they're non-traditional in that the little hook parts like stick out, but at the end of the day, it's just a sculpture, but it's using this really non-traditional material. Then you combine the use of non-traditional materials with a non-traditional use, right? So a non-traditional material here of a fluorescent light, but then using it like a line, but it's a line in space, right? So it's not a traditional sculpture. It's not a traditional material. It's this combination of the 2 different things. And again, is the light the medium? Is like the physical waves of light the medium, or is the space the medium, right? Or just the idea of changing our perception and all of this, or just introducing a new medium. It's very interesting. And then of course we have the last of these three. You can see I'm kind of setting up a spectrum here: traditional use of non-traditional, non-traditional use of non-traditional, and the non-traditional use of traditional, right? And I like to point out this piece, which again is one of my favorites. The Cremation Project by John Baldessari. Throughout I think it was the 70s, he created this entire body of work that were all these paintings that he made. So very traditional use of material, traditional creation of objects. And then Baldessari took these paintings. I believe he displayed them once or displayed them to some select people, didn't allow them to be photographed. I don't think you can find any photographs of these, but at the end of the day, he took his paintings and then, with limited display of them, burned them, right? And then buried them, pulverized them, and buried them in barrels, right? So they were literally like cremated paintings. And now those paintings, those pieces exist only as memories, right? They are gone. Their physical existence has been turned into ash, right? And the idea of them, the memory of them, is all that's left. And of course, we don't know them, and again, I probably could dig up. I'm sure there's photographs of them, but at the end of the day, for the most part, there's no real painting left, right? And it's actually funny because this is also the case for a lot of, artworks that have, disappeared or been destroyed over the last couple hundred years. We have photographs of them, but we don't have the actual object, right? So now they're just photographs. I don't know. Andy Goldsworthy often talks about how he makes those earthworks and then photographs them, and then the sculpture disappears. So really, is he a photographer or is he a sculptor? Right? All these things around the non-traditional use of materials. Most artists today have to be photographers, but in any case, they're trucking in ideas as much as they're trucking. I haven't even gotten into like NFTs and stuff in this slideshow. That's like a whole new thing. But in general, right, we're just talking about idea as the medium. Once again, like these artists are breaking ground because they're coming up with new thoughts. And I like to close it with this very fun image, one of my favorite Magritte pieces. It is, this is not a pipe, because it's a painting of a pipe. It's not actually a pipe. Yeah, it's a fun kind of thing to cover. And again, I just kind of do that for my own fun. But that covers chapter 9, and some non-traditional ideas around media. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a nice day.